In the late 1970s, you didn't choose what to watch. You surrendered to the dial and a local station manager who decided your afternoon was better spent with a talking mule or a singing greaser. If your thumb was the remote and the TV guide was your Bible, you lived through an era where choice was an illusion, but the memories were permanent. When TVs took minutes to warm up and rabbit ears wore foil, we were a captive audience. The late 70s off hours were a frontier of recycled hits. This was the strip era. Same show, same time, every weekday. That's why we knew every punchline by heart. Let's count down the 23 shows that defined your dial. The first thing you'd hear was that iconic twinkling harpsichord theme and the animated Samantha nose twitch. It worked in reruns because the suburban supernatural premise was ironclad. You didn't need to know the lore to enjoy Darren getting turned into a poodle. This show was a pioneer of the 100-episode rule, the magic number a series needed to hit to be profitable in syndication. Of course, by the time we were watching the reruns, we were playing the "Which Darren is this" game. Most of us preferred the frantic energy of Dick York over the slightly more stoic Dick Sargent. But Samantha's miniskirts remained a universal constant for the 50-plus demographic today. The visual was unmistakable. Scratchy, high-contrast black and white film, a dog with a circle around its eye, and kids in oversized hats. These weren't even TV shows. They were theatrical shorts from the 20s and 30s known as Our Gang. King World Productions bought the rights and turned them into a television phenomenon decades after they were filmed. They worked because the slapstick was primal, and the He-Man Woman Haters Club was a concept every kid understood. It's a bit surreal to realize that while we were watching these in 1977, some of the actors on screen were already in their 60s or had passed away. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the vault, hit that subscribe button. We're building the 70s one frame at a time, and you don't want to miss our next trip down memory lane. The Dutch angle, where the camera was tilted to make the villain's lair look off balance, was the signature look of the 1966 Batman. In the late 70s, this show was stripped across local stations because it was a visual explosion of pop art. It worked because kids saw it as an action show, while the adults realized it was a high-level satire of the genre. Adam West played it so straight it was brilliant. Did you know the show was actually expensive to produce, which is why it only lasted 3 seasons? But in syndication, those 120 episodes played on a loop for 20 years. The sound of a can being squeezed open and a frantic muttered monologue. These cartoons were the ultimate filler for local stations. Most of the ones we saw in the late 70s were the old Max Fleischer shorts from the 30s and 40s. They were weirdly atmospheric and featured some of the best animation of the era. The cultural note here is that Popeye actually boosted spinach consumption in the US by 33% during the Depression, and in the 70s, it was still convincing us that canned greens were a viable path to super strength. There's no need to fear. That rhyming, nasally hero voice belonged to Wally Cox, a mild-mannered actor who was famously the best friend of Marlon Brando. Underdog was a staple of the Saturday morning leftovers that moved into weekday syndication. It was a simple, repetitive formula. Sweet Polly purebred gets in trouble. Shoeshine Boy takes a super energy pill, which they later had to edit out for obvious reasons, and he saves the day. The crunch of a carrot and that "what's up, doc" attitude. These Looney Tunes shorts were the backbone of independent station programming. They worked because Mel Blanc's voice work was, and is, the gold standard of the industry. These weren't made for children. They were made for adult moviegoers in the 1940s, which is why the humor felt so sharp and the classical music references were so deep. The sight of a bamboo radio and a millionaire in a tuxedo on a desert island. This show is the poster child for the syndication success story. It was a modest hit on CBS, but it became a religion in the 70s reruns. Sherwood Schwartz, the creator, intentionally designed the characters as social archetypes so that everyone in America could identify with at least one of them. It was the ultimate what-if scenario that we revisited every single day at 5:30 p.m. The sound of stone wheels screeching and Fred yelling for Wilma. As the first animated sitcom to air in prime time, the Flintstones had enough adult structure to work in the evening hours. It was essentially the Honeymooners with a dinosaur for a vacuum cleaner. Interestingly, the show was originally titled The Flagstones and was pitched as a much more cynical look at suburban life. By the late 70s, it was just pure Stone Age comfort food. That staccato, high-pitched laugh. Woody was the ultimate jerk protagonist, and that's why we loved him. He didn't have a moral compass. He just wanted to peck things and cause problems. Created by Walter Lantz, Woody was one of the few cartoon characters to get a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In the 70s, these shorts were used to fill the gaps because they were fast-paced and required almost no attention span. The sound of a bowling ball hitting a cat's head. These shorts were the pinnacle of silent storytelling. Because there was almost no dialogue, they were incredibly cheap to syndicate globally. The 1940s era, directed by Fred Quimby, featured some of the most fluid, beautiful animation ever put to film. It was high-stakes domestic warfare, and we were always secretly rooting for the cat to get one win. Just one. The blue-tiled bathroom in the AstroTurf backyard. Like Gilligan, this show's legacy was built entirely on the back of 1970s syndication. It offered a vision of a blended family that was completely devoid of actual conflict, which made it the perfect de-stressor for the end of a long day. A bit of value for the historians. The Brady kids were so popular that they actually toured as a singing group, which led to the somewhat disastrous variety show we all try to forget. The big reveal when a person realized they've been pranked by Alan Funt. This was the grandfather of reality TV. It worked in reruns because human nature doesn't change. Watching someone get confused by a car with no engine is always funny. The show started on radio as Candid Microphone in 1947, and by the late 70s, it was the perfect filler because you could jump in at any point and know what was happening. We're halfway through the heavy hitters. If these shows are bringing back memories of wood-paneled dens and TV dinners, drop a comment and tell us which one was must-watch in your house. If you lived in the South, Sunday mornings or late Saturday nights weren't complete without a man in a polyester polo shirt pointing at grainy 16mm film with a wooden stick. Whether it was Vince Dooley at Georgia or Bear Bryant at Alabama, these coaches' shows were syndicated staples. They were essentially half-hour commercials for the university, but for a football fan in 1978, it was the only way to see the highlights before ESPN existed. The dramatic, sweeping theme and the narration that made a squirrel's life sound like a Shakespearean tragedy. This was a Time Life television production that focused on high-quality nature footage. In the 70s, this was Our Planet Earth. It was educational enough that parents didn't mind you watching it, but dramatic enough to keep you from changing the channel. The sound of the audience yelling, "Get ready to match the stars!" This was the nighttime version of the daytime hit. The PM version was syndicated and usually had higher stakes and slightly bluer jokes. Richard Dawson, Brett Somers, and Charles Nelson Riley were the holy trinity of the panel. The show worked because it felt like a cocktail party that we were allowed to peek in on. The bubble machine and the champagne music. After ABC canceled him in 1971, Welk did something revolutionary. He built his own syndication network. He proved that an older audience was a gold mine. For a man over 50 today, this show probably reminds you of your parents or grandparents refusing to let you change the channel to anything with a guitar. It was the most wholesome thing on television, run by a man who was a legendary taskmaster behind the scenes. A cornfield full of people popping up to tell one-liners, and a bloodhound sitting on a porch. Like Welk, Hee Haw was a victim of the rural purge at CBS, where the network canceled anything that appealed to a country audience. It went into syndication and became a juggernaut. It was a brilliant mix of top-tier Nashville talent and vaudeville humor. Buck Owens and Roy Clark were the perfect hosts for a show that never took itself seriously. The X and O boxes and the incomparable Paul Lynde. This show was all about the zingers. The contestants were secondary to the celebrities in the boxes. it was first-run syndication at its finest. The set was a 3-story nightmare of lighting and wiring, but it created a sense of scale that made it feel like a major event every night at 7 p.m. Where was the most unusual place you ever made whoopee? Bob Eubank's signature question became a cultural catchphrase. This show was a psychological study wrapped in a game show. We watched for the inevitable moment when a husband said something stupid and his wife hit him with her card. It was the original social experiment TV, and it was consistently one of the highest rated shows in syndication. The sound of the bell and the roar of the crowd. While it was a daytime staple, the nighttime Price is Right was a syndicated version that aired once a week in many markets. It featured the same games, but often with bigger prizes. It's the longest running game show in history for a reason. The pricing hook is something everyone can play from their couch. I can name that tune in one note. This show was pure adrenaline. Whether it was the Big Seven or the Golden Medley, it was a test of musical knowledge that included a live orchestra and a lot of running. Hosted by Tom Kennedy in the late 70s, it was the perfect high-energy bridge between the news and primetime. The futuristic electronic theme song and the fast-paced editing. This was a unique franchise model. Each local station had its own 2 hosts, but they shared segments with other stations across the country. It was the first time we saw lifestyle television that felt local and national at the same time. It was the precursor to Entertainment Tonight and every local news magazine that followed. The sound of the strike buzzer. Richard Dawson was the ultimate host, part charismatic charmer, part cynical uncle. The syndicated evening version of the Feud was the peak of the format. It worked because the questions weren't about facts, they were about opinions. It was a game about how people thought, which made it infinitely watchable. In the late 1970s, we didn't have content. We had shows. We had a shared language of theme songs and catchphrases that everyone in the country understood, because we were all watching the same 23 programs on a loop. That's the power of the era. A limited dial, a few channels, and a lot of great memories. So I want to hear from you. Which one of these shows did you watch the most? And what was the one show you made sure to be in front of the TV for every single night without fail? Drop your memories in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going.